Welcome again to everybody to this exciting launch event. We are thrilled to have four speakers who can speak from different angles about what cities and other local actors can do to improve wild animal welfare through smart changes to their infrastructure and built environment. And this is the launch event for a report on exactly this topic, wild animal welfare and local policies on land use and the built environment. And the general idea of this report, as well as this conversation, is that cities and other local actors are soon going to be making decisions about how to make their infrastructures, make their built environments more resilient and more sustainable in the face of human-caused climate change. And the question is, how can they consider human and non-human health and welfare so that they can build a safer, more resilient, more sustainable environment for all local stakeholders, everybody who needs to share this space. So this report attempts to start filling in some key knowledge gaps about how we can include wild animal welfare in these conversations so that we can build a better environment for humans and animals and the environment alike. So we are thrilled to be able to both share this report with the world, which you can find online, and then also have this conversation about it here today. So before we turn over to our speakers, I want to briefly thank some people who have been really instrumental in bringing us to this place. First of all, thanks to a person who we will be hearing from shortly, Alyssa White, who was the lead author of this report and did fantastic work. I also want to thank the three programs that sponsored the development of this report. First of all, the NYU Guarini Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law. Second of all, the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program. And third of all, the Yale Law, Ethics, and Animals Program. And I also want to give a brief shout out to Wild Animal Initiative, who are at least informally partners on all of these projects related to wild animal welfare. Thank you to all of those programs. And then finally, I want to thank a couple of our supporters for making this project possible. First of all, Mark Ridner, and second of all, Open Philanthropy. Thank you for supporting our work and allowing us to raise awareness and generate new knowledge about how we can build a better community for humans and animals in the environment at the same time. Now, with all of that out of the way, I will briefly introduce our speakers. I am not going to give you their bios because their bios are long and we want to leave as much time as possible for actual conversation, but you will soon be hearing from the following people in the following order, and then we can have a conversation. First of all, again, Alyssa White, legal fellow at the Guarini Center and lead author of this report that will be the main topic of conversation today, followed by Dr. Mal Graham, strategy director at Wild Animal Initiative, followed by Cecil Scheib, chief sustainability officer at the NYU Office of Sustainability, followed finally by Alexandra Silver, the director of the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare for the city of New York. So they will deliver brief remarks in that order, and then that will be the basis for a conversation that we can all have. So as they are delivering the remarks, feel free to think about questions or comments that you may have. Those of you who are here with us in person today, when the time comes to have a discussion, you can raise your hands and turn on your mics and ask a question directly. For those of you who are joining us online, feel free to enter questions and comments at any point by entering them in the Q&A tab on Zoom. And then we can alternate back and forth between in-person and online questions during the discussion. Okay, now with all of that out of the way, Alyssa, please take it away. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here.
All right, well, thank you all so much for being here today. As Jeff was saying, my name is Alyssa White. I'm a legal fellow at the Guarini Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law. And I'm here to kick off the conversation by presenting some of the findings from our new report about wild animal welfare in local policies on land use in the built environment. So I wanted to get started for folks who may be less familiar with the concept of wild animal welfare, because it is central to this policy brief. So first of all, we define a wild animal as an animal living autonomously from humans. And we define welfare as the biological, behavioral, and mental functioning of individual animals, ranging from generally negative to generally positive. So something I want to emphasize is that this report looks at the lives and the well-being of individual wild animals. That's the level that we're thinking about. There are many other reports and policies that are focusing on species level concerns or biodiversity concerns, which are also super important concerns as well. This report in particular focuses on the individual animal level, wild animal welfare. So a couple other quick notes about the scope of this paper. We focus on land use and built environment policies. That includes everything from green infrastructure to buildings and roads. Those are the types of policies we focus on in this particular policy brief. There's many other policies that affect the welfare of wild animals, but for purposes of this, keeping this policy brief under maybe 1,000 pages, we decided to just focus in on land use and the built environment for now. And then next, we focus on specifically on local government policies. So policies that cities and localities can implement. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And then finally, we talk about policies that benefit humans, animals, and the climate. So the focus of this policy brief is giving examples of what we call win-win-win policies that may promote the welfare of both humans and animals, and also either promote climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation and resilience. So that's some of the a bit more about the scope of this paper. So I wanted to dive into a bit about the why. Why wild animal welfare? Why cities and local governments? So first, I wanted to emphasize the importance of animal sentience and well-being. So we have scientific evidence to show that a wide range of wild animals are sentient or sufficiently likely to be sentient. So they have capacity for subjective experiences, both negative and positive. So something that we emphasize is that the lives and the well-being of wild animals matters, and it should be taken into account. And yet, wild animal welfare is not being systematically taken into account at any level of government. So then you might wonder, okay, why cities? Why not the federal government or state governments? So in particular, we focus in on cities because they're already taking action to reshape their land use and built environment policies in the face of the climate crisis, to address stressors like flooding and extreme heat and drought. So in this moment of great change to address the climate crisis, it's also a moment of opportunity to begin to think about wild animal welfare in these policies and, as we'll talk about a bit, implement some policies that benefit humans, animals, and the climate, and as well as promote a healthy environment more broadly. So something else we acknowledge in this report is that there are challenges that cities will face to incorporate wild animal welfare, including the first challenge being scientific uncertainty, that there remains uncertainty around the net impacts of local policies on the welfare of wild animals. So in addition to scientific uncertainty, there are also trade-offs and capacity challenges. So cities may be concerned how policies impact different animals, as well as have trade-offs between humans and animals. In addition to those trade-offs, capacity concerns, as we know, city governments are facing many different issues, and they might be saying, well, how can I take wild animal welfare into account when I'm dealing with truly 1,000 other things, and I just learned about wild animal welfare today? How can I take this into account? So acknowledging all of those challenges, we still think that cities and local governments can start to take modest first steps to incorporate wild animal welfare into their policymaking and planning processes. So the hope with this policy brief is to present some of these first steps and really give local governments a menu of options that they can peruse and think about what types of policies and planning processes would work best in their environments and in their jurisdictions. And again, emphasizing the win-win-win policies, many of which are in this report that may benefit humans, animals, and the climate and environment more broadly. So yeah, moving on to some of the policy section in this policy brief, we have a section on overarching approaches to incorporate wild animal welfare. And then we dive into there's over 25 different discrete policies that cities can implement that may benefit humans, animals, and the climate. I'll start with some of the overarching approaches, and then to close out the presentation, I'll just give a couple of policy examples just to get you excited and hopefully, cause you to go on the computer and open that PDF for the full policy brief. So in terms of overarching approaches, these first two are kind of the low-hanging fruit, initial options that cities can think about for incorporating wild animal welfare. So the first is including wild animal welfare in ongoing city planning processes. So cities already have many planning processes that affect wild animal welfare, including their green infrastructure plans, buildings-related plans, land use, biodiversity plans, climate action plans. All of these plans impact wild animals, and cities could get started by taking wild animal welfare into account in these plans, either through a new section in these plans or thinking about other ways to begin to weave it in to their planning processes. And then second, cities can begin to incorporate wild animal welfare into any existing wildlife monitoring programs that they have in the city. So many cities have wildlife monitoring either in open spaces, parks, urban forests, at least some element of monitoring what animals are there and other elements of what animals are there, what are they up to. So in their existing programs, in the policy brief, we recommend that cities begin to take stock of environmental conditions that are likely to affect wild animal welfare. So there's many of these, but a couple examples include exposure to anthropogenic noise, especially high decibel noise, exposure to artificial light at night, extreme heat, as well as habitat connectivity, habitat availability, and availability of food sources from trees and shrubs. So that could be nuts, berries, things that animals consume. So those are a couple examples of environmental conditions cities could be tracking that are likely to impact wild animal welfare. And in addition, we also recommend that where possible, cities who are looking to bolster their monitoring programs, they could consider taking measures of body conditions of animals, not just the presence or absence of animals in a given area. And we also recommend that cities go beyond just monitoring endangered species to think about also the well-being and monitoring more common species in the city, even if they're not endangered or threatened. So third, we talk in the policy brief about the option to establish either an official or an office focused on animal welfare. I'm not going to talk about that too much now because we have Alex here with us today from the New York City Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare, really a rock star, and I'm really excited to hear from Alex about that. So I'll quickly mention numbers 4 and 5. Developing an animal welfare planning process is another option. So as cities begin to develop more capacity to consider wild animal welfare, they could consider developing some type of planning document to take wild animal welfare and animal welfare more broadly into account across city planning and city policy. So the policy brief gives the example of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. They have an animals agenda that they regularly update that identifies key policies and planning to support welfare of both wild and captive animals in the city. They identify interagency coordination on those policies, which is really exciting to see. And I recommend people go to the policy brief to learn more about Amsterdam's animal agenda. And then finally, number 5, passing wildlife ordinances. Cities can think about bundling together some policies that promote animal welfare into a wildlife ordinance or a law that they pass that applies to private lands. So one example of this, the city of Los Angeles currently has a draft wildlife ordinance in a wildlife district in the Santa Monica Mountains. And this wildlife ordinance bundles together a number of policies, including bird-friendly building materials, wildlife-friendly fencing, and a number of other policies that may benefit wild animals into one wildlife ordinance. So I know throwing a lot of information at you, but I hope these are just giving you some of the ideas of what's in the report and getting people's minds churning about how cities can start to incorporate wild animal welfare. So I wanted to close out with a couple discrete policy examples, policies that can benefit humans, animals, and the climate. So the report, like I mentioned, lists over 25 different potential policies. So there's no way, I tried to memorize, how can I say them all fast in a row, but I decided not to, I scratched that from the program. So anyway, there's 6 different categories we talk about in the report. So we group different policy options into these categories, but I'm just going to share 3 quick examples before wrapping up for my section, before turning it over to the other excellent speakers. So the first example I wanted to give is local policies that require bird-friendly building materials. So these types of policies benefit humans and the climate because they can promote more energy efficiency in buildings. Some of the bird-friendly building materials can improve building energy efficiency. And it turns out, as you can see from this New York Times article, people are distressed and really don't like seeing hundreds of birds, tens or hundreds of birds die at their apartment or at their place of work or even in their city. So it benefits humans in reducing they're having to witness this. And then in addition, of course, it benefits animals by reducing the bird mortality from these window collisions, as well as reducing pain and suffering for birds that survive the window collisions. Another policy is some localities have begun to prohibit gas lawn equipment. And this has a number of benefits for humans and animals. First of which is about high decibel noise. I don't know if anyone's ever been near a gas leaf blower and tried to have a conversation, but it is a truly grating noise. And it turns out that it impacts human health. It causes hearing loss among lawn care workers, as well as negatively impacting many critical life functions for wild animals, including foraging, animal communication, animal movement. So some localities have begun to phase out gas lawn equipment, not to mention for the air pollution and the health effects from the pollutants that are being released from gas lawn equipment. And then finally, to close out, I just had to get a picture of owls in here. So this is another policy that cities are starting to implement, are policies to protect mature, larger trees. So I think many people may have heard about tree planting initiatives that cities are doing. While those are also really important, it's important to protect these larger mature trees because they give large shade benefits. So that's to address the urban heat island effect, reduce extreme heat, so benefits to humans and addressing climate change there. And then also benefits animals by creating additional shelter. Large trees, in comparison to smaller trees, provide more opportunities for shelter, tend to provide greater food benefits to animals, as well as also preventing the extreme heat impacts on animals. So thank you all so much for being here today. And thank you to all the speakers and everyone who's supported this work. It's been really an amazing project to work on. And I hope this has just given you an initial taste of what's in the policy brief. And I hope you'll check out the rest of the brief online. But I'll turn it over to, without further ado, turn it over to Mal. And thank you all so much.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So if you're not familiar with Wild Animal Initiative, we're a scientific organization that works to accelerate wild animal welfare science. And we do that by conducting our own research and outreach, as well as providing grants to external scientists. And I'm going to cover 3 topics very briefly today. The first is, how is wild animal welfare distinct from biodiversity? The second is, how can we measure wild animal welfare today? And the third is, how can policymakers and scientists work together on the topic of wild animal welfare? So on the first topic, biodiversity in very simple terms is essentially the amount of different kinds of biological stuff. And so in a given environment, you might have various metrics of biodiversity, like species richness, so the number of different species that are present in that area, maybe relative species abundance, so the proportion of different species that are in that area, different kinds of diversity related to genetics, so like different kinds of genetic diversity that are present in the plants and animals in that area. And biodiversity conceptually is just fully distinct from welfare. As Alyssa defined, welfare is related to the sense of an animal's well-being in itself. You'll see lots of different definitions of welfare in the literature, but all of them tend to include, how is the animal doing from its own perspective? Is it feeling pretty good or is it feeling bad? And just to kind of make concrete the way these things can be different, New York City has recorded more than 400 different species of birds at one time or another in the city. That's a pretty good bit of avian biodiversity. But if many of those birds are flying into buildings or ingesting rat poison, that is pretty bad for their welfare. So you can certainly have high biodiversity and low welfare, or vice versa. And in terms of the empirical connections between these things, like even if conceptually they're different, as a matter of fact, they may be connected, that just really has not been studied. I cannot point you to a single study that has kind of overviewed how biodiversity impacts welfare or vice versa. And there's lots of interesting things to say about that topic. But for the sake of time, I'll move on to the next question, which is, how can we measure wild animal welfare today? So there are many metrics of welfare that have been established in captive animal welfare science. And the issue that wild animal welfare scientists faced is translating those metrics into the wild context. But we are able to do that. The most important thing to remember, though, is that there is no single metric that is like, oh, you take this measurement and you know the animal's welfare. Instead, you have to take a lot of different kinds of measures and pool them together. They all have different pros and cons to get a good sense of how the animal is doing on the whole. There are many different kinds of metrics, but some of the most common are behavioral or physiological. So in the behavioral category, you can think of things like animal vocalizations, its body posture, the number of different kinds of its behaviors it's able to express. In the physiological category, you might think of like particular kind of hormone levels. And just to give a concrete example, one that is really intuitive might be just like an animal's vocalization. So if an animal is crying out in pain, that's a pretty good sign that its welfare is not good in that moment. A less intuitive example might be related to oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is damage to tissues and cells that are caused by a certain class of oxygen-carrying molecules. If you've ever heard of like an antioxidant food, those are things we're supposed to eat to reduce the number of oxidant molecules in our bloodstream, theoretically. So it turns out some of our scientists have kind of recently worked on the question of some metrics of oxidative stress tend to go up when the animal is doing poorly and tend to go down when the animal is doing well. And so that means oxidative stress might be a decent holistic measure of welfare for some animals. Many different kinds of metrics. I would be happy to talk about more examples if anyone wants to ask questions about that, but I'll move on to the last question, which is how can policymakers and scientists work together on the topic of wild animal welfare? There is absolutely a rich literature on the topic of how scientists and policymakers can work together in general, and I am definitely not an expert in it, so I will not survey it today, but what I can tell you about are the circumstances that face wild animal welfare science in particular. And the number one thing that is characteristic of our condition is that we are a very, very new science. So we've really only just started trying to apply questions about welfare in the context of animals not directly controlled by humans. And that means that there just are some limitations that policymakers need to keep in mind when thinking about how we can make policy informed by science. And I think one of the most important ways that policymakers can kind of respect these limitations of this novel science are included in this report. So one is trying to use policy when possible to spur additional research, whether that means finding funding for more science on this topic or even including data collection or monitoring regimes into policy. And the second thing I'd recommend is making policy flexible. And so that means instead of writing down, hey, use this type of green infrastructure because we know that's what's good for wild animal welfare, maybe do something more like, let's use the type of green infrastructure that's recommended by wild animal welfare scientists, something like that, where that's possible in order to build in flexibility so that we can update the recommendations as we learn more in the science. And so, yeah, I think that this document does a good job of kind of illustrating how there's a few things that we're pretty confident are good for wild animal welfare and a longer list of things where we hope that they're good for wild animal welfare, but we don't really have enough data to say for sure yet. And I really look forward to seeing more work like that in the policy space and hope that scientists can continue participating in the conversation. So, yeah, thanks so much.
Cecil Scheib.
Good morning, everyone. And good morning to everyone on Zoom, our favorite place to be when it is raining. So my name's Cecil. I work here at NYU. I first came to NYU in 2007, which was the year after NYU students said, we need an office of sustainability so NYU can do more. So students, don't doubt that your activism makes a difference. And I had certain thoughts prepared, but I think I'm going to adjust some on what I've heard from the first two speakers. So, the NYU Office of Sustainability works closely with students, including students groups that care about animal welfare. We work to support faculty, many of whom are in this room and doing such great work in the environment. And we work on NYU's own operational performance, right? How do we have less impact? And probably some of the greatest good we've done for animals as a whole is in terms of reducing our own greenhouse gas emissions, right? We pledged to the city of New York in 2007 that we would reduce our emissions. Our on-site emissions are almost exclusively from the energy used by our buildings. We promised to reduce them 30% in 10 years. We did that in 5 years, just 5 years, by the year 2012, which is the equivalent of planting all of Brooklyn and all of Manhattan in forest, right? We have a big impact. But what I'm sort of, like inspired to talk about and what I heard is that it wasn't just that we put our own house in order. It's that NYU was, or started to, we're far from done. We have the goal to be carbon neutral by the year 2040, and we still have a ways to go. But in addition to working on campus, we were a participant in citywide processes around policy, around green buildings. This included the Green Codes Task Force, and what eventually led up to Local Law 97, and I'm looking at Professor Wyman, who's been intimately involved in that work with the city, right? Legislating the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from building. And that's partially made possible by those who go first, do things voluntarily before they are mandated, test, can report on data, can share that data, can share successes, what works and what doesn't. And it was very exciting to be part of that process and see the sort of evolution over a 10 or 15 year period into that. In more recent years, we have participated in something called the Cool Food Pledge, which is a commitment to reduce our emissions from the food we purchase 25% by the year 2030. Now, this is not specifically a animal welfare goal. It is distinct. It's a carbon goal. But if you do it carefully, those two goals can work together because you're going to try to reduce the consumption of animal products towards your carbon goals. Now that goal, NYU was able to commit to that goal quite largely due to the support of the faculty in this room, right? Jeff, Colin, Matthew, in the NYU Environmental Studies Department, who said, yeah, this is established science, right? We have vetted this work that's done. And again, that's more about domesticated animals. That's more about a carbon policy. And it's not that NYU hasn't done things for wild animal welfare directly. We have done some things. If you look at the Paulson Center, our newest glass building there at the corner of Mercer and Houston Street, you see a lot of glass, but the fritting, right, the dots and the dashes that are added to that glass were specifically designed to reduce bird collisions. And that was done not just by NYU, but working in conjunction with outside entities. We have planted native species all around campus. We strive to reduce the use of gas-powered equipment in favor of more quiet equipment. We've even funded people to plant the food that monarch butterflies eat on their migration on campus to help support these things. So these are all great examples, but these are sort of the nascent examples. And I couldn't be more excited to be part of the development of the scientific rigor that can get translated into policy rigor over time, right? In the same way that we were able to sign the Cool Food Pledge after it was, developed and ready for that, you see the wild animal welfare starting that journey, right? Starting to develop that rigor. And I'm so pleased that NYU is able to be part of it. And I'll just comment personally, I'm very pleased that I'm able to be part of it. I've been vegan for almost 35 years. And like many on this campus, I share this, compassion for animals. In fact, many people may be more motivated by their compassion for individual animals, including wild animals that they encounter, than they are about sort of biodiversity or more hard to grasp or sort of abstruse concepts. And so, the Cool Food Pledge was an opportunity for those who care to bring scientific rigor and data and a firm goal and metrics to something that we innately knew was of value. And I see this work in wild animal welfare and the science and the policy to be another opportunity to bring our compassion and our caring for the non-human world into the spaces where we work and live and inhabit every day. So I'm so grateful to be part of it, so grateful to those who are working on it. And now we'll turn things over to Alex.
Props. Hi, everybody. Is that good? I'm short, so let me just lower that a little. I'm so honored to be here today with this wonderful panel celebrating really the release of this incredible report. My name is Alex Silver. I'm with the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare. So when something like this comes out, obviously I get very excited that everyone's on board with it. A lot of people don't even know there is a Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare, that we're changing that. And with resources like this, it really enables my office. I think it gives it a very good tool to go out and see what can we do, see other people are interested in it and really push it forward. So again, I'm honored, I'm grateful. I'm also very, very glad that this report exists and I am going to be using it. I refer to it as a Bible. I think it can be a very good resource. So thank you. And I'm glad that New York comes up several times in it. As Alyssa mentioned, an Office of Animal Welfare or an official is one of the recommendations, one of the overarching recommendations in this report for wild animal welfare. So I am thrilled that New York can be is a leader on that front. And I'll talk a little bit about what the Office of Animal Welfare is, because I imagine even for many of you here who are presumably interested in animal welfare, this may be new to you. So I will speak a little bit about that. And before I do that, though, I want to say about wildlife, it's very easy when we're in Lower Manhattan to forget how diverse New York City is and the amazing ecosystems that we have. Again, this audience is probably more aware than others that we have such great environments. We have wetlands, we have wonderful forested areas. You go out to Randall's Island and you can't believe you're still in the city, right? It's really incredible. So we need this here in New York. If people are wondering, like, why New York City? That we have amazing ecosystems here, and it's important that we protect them and do what we can to protect the wildlife that lives there. So the Office of Animal Welfare, the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare, it was created formally in 2020 following legislation by the City Council in 2019 that said the city should have an Office of Animal Welfare. And it followed years of having an animal welfare liaison, which started in 2015. So since 2015, the mayor's office had somebody who was the point person for animal welfare issues in New York City. And it's a very broad purview. If you look at the city charter, which is where this is all codified, you'll see it lists several different topics that the office can weigh in on, but it's not limited to. So it'll say pet stores, animal shelters, zoos, exotic animals, wildlife management. And the list is pretty long, and then it says, including. So it's a broad purview. And I'm, often doing a lot with companion animal welfare. Working animals comes up a lot. But wildlife, as I mentioned, in New York is a big topic and an important one. And one that I would hope doesn't just come up when there's conflicts, but when we see that we're fortunate to have this population in our city. So what does the office do? Okay, well, it helps with the coordination and collaboration among city agencies that are already doing a lot of work, some of which already tasked with, handling animal issues, and some of which probably don't think about animals. They're focused on other issues, but inevitably animal issues come up. So, for example, the Parks Department is probably, and DEP, our Environmental Protection Department, these are the departments that deal most directly with wildlife. But of course, it's going to come up with DOT, with transportation issues. It's going to come up on properties when people are saying, how do I handle this with wild animal? NYPD investigates animal cruelty. They're the lead agency on that. Department of Health oversees pet stores and animal shelters. So those agencies, they have very direct protocols or, responsibilities. But then, Department of Social Services, NYCHA, again, they're going to come across animal issues. People who have pets in shelters, again, wildlife on public or private properties. So the office can really bring everyone together, can be a point person to connect and work on different best practices, improving what we're already doing, and also looking at what we can do, which is why, again, this report comes in so handy, because part of what the office can do is say, hey, we need some policies that benefit wild animal welfare, recognizing that it's not in a bubble. That's probably the main takeaway I always want people to get from the fact that we have an Office of Animal Welfare. It's that animal issues, animal welfare does not exist in a bubble. And again, that's the main takeaway from this report, talking about how what we can do for wild animal welfare will often improve our climate. It'll help humans. It's win-win-win, as Alyssa said, in many cases, not all cases, or we don't know in all cases, but in many cases. So, the report, again, I think is going to be a wonderful resource for an office such as mine. And it does mention some things that New York is already doing, which I'm, again, glad to say beyond having an office. So I'll just speak a little bit about that, and then maybe we'll talk about more in the panel. But Alyssa mentioned the bird-friendly legislation. So that's one thing I'd want to point to, because New York City has, as of Local Law 15, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm forgetting the year 2019, I think it passed, became effective in 2021. I think she's referring to the report. Excellent. So that requires bird-friendly materials in any new buildings in New York City or any certain alterations to facades. And it's really a wonderful example of this legislation, I think. As was stated, you don't want to necessarily be too prescriptive in what you say, so having guidelines, and this law talks about the American Bird Conservancy wildlife threat factors when you're talking about what materials to use. So I think that's an example of what we were talking about. And again, I'm so proud that New York City has this legislation and is leading the way on that. The report also talks about the potential for lights out legislation to protect birds. And bird collisions, unfortunately, may be on more people's minds now because of FLACO, right? Even though that, of course, is rodenticide, there's a lot of other issues there, but that got a lot of attention, and maybe there's potential there to do more. New York City already does have lights out legislation for city-owned and city-leased buildings, which again I think is very impressive and good for New York to be leading the way on that. And of course, there's always more we can do and more we can look into, but it's something that New York is really wanting to deal with. As you said, people don't want to see that, and it also has energy benefits. We can all win. Another example I just wanted to highlight, and I think it's in a footnote of the report, is a project in Staten Island that our Parks Department has been working on. It's the Travis Avenue reconstruction. And what it is part of climate resiliency plan and lifting the shorelines plan, right? We're raising the road because of flooding and issues with this particular section of transportation. But we're not just raising it. We have a natural resources group at the Parks Department that has done wonderful work, did a study to see, well, how will this affect the crossings of terrestrial animals, right? Of our terrapins, other small mammals. And we are going to incorporate wildlife passages into this raising of the road, which is a really, I think, very cool thing that we're doing. And it will accompany, as was mentioned, it will have with it accompanied. Apologies, I have not had coffee. I had tea. So I'm a little scattered, but it will have studies accompanied with it. So we will be doing, we'll be monitoring that and seeing, and hopefully it can inform future projects. And the last thing I just wanted to bring up now, and again, we could talk about so many other things, maybe they'll come up, but I did want to alert everyone that we are working in New York City on an urban forest master plan, which builds off of something that already exists, and you can see online, it's the forest framework from the Parks and Natural Areas Conservancy. That plan talks about how we're doing, how we're building our tree canopy and caring for it in parks. And this new plan is going to build off of that and talk about the tree canopy across the city. And it's part of our New York City's effort to get to 30% tree canopy. And it's in its initial phases, which is good timing for this report. Because again, this allows me now to go and say, hey, we're working on this wonderful report. How are we going to incorporate? Can we incorporate wildlife? And start that conversation. And honestly, I think just even starting that conversation is huge because we've never really done that. It's just been taken for granted. Last thing I want to end with is my little show and tell, my prop. Some of you may have seen this. I don't know where the camera's for Zoom, but it says New Yorkers, has a little picture of some of our wild neighbors. And this is part of New York City's Wildlife NYC campaign. So several years ago, and you can still go on and see this website, but several years ago, there was an ad campaign. It was in subways, it was on bus stops, had pictures of deer, raccoons, coyotes, saying basically, they're New Yorkers too. And I love that campaign. It's not active on transportation anymore, but it is on a website. If you go to nyc.gov/wildlife, maybe Wildlife NYC, you will see this website that is an amazing resource. It has information on 14 different species that call New York home, and it has tips on how we coexist. And that's really the message that I think the city is working on conveying and can contribute, in that we need to coexist with wildlife, right? We need to recognize that we have it, we're fortunate to have it, and how can we live with it and benefit from it while benefiting it. So I encourage everyone to check out the Wildlife NYC website. It's really a wonderful resource. You can sign the Coexistence Pledge, which offers tips on how you're going to help with wildlife. And also in New York City, we have urban park rangers that do events all the time. So if you want to get engaged with this wonderful, our wonderful natural resources, our parks, check out that calendar, and you can figure out a day to go birding and wildlife observation trips and all of that wonderful stuff. I should have mentioned, with Wildlife NYC, we have, because I think this is pretty unique, in New York City, a wildlife unit for the city. So our city parks department has its own wildlife unit, and they're the ones that are really monitoring and running this Wildlife NYC page. So our parks department, I feel like, we could do an hour presentation just on what they do. But I hope I gave you a good taste of that. If anyone wants these little packets too, I have some leftover Wildlife NYC cards, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for those remarks. And now we have plenty of time to have a conversation. So as I noted before, we have people in the room with us, and then we also have people viewing online. Questions have already been coming in via the Q&A tab on Zoom. So those of you who are online, please continue to enter questions, comments in the Q&A tab, and we will integrate those into the conversation we have here in the room. And I can open with a question that was actually submitted prior to the start of this event to kick us off, and then you can all be thinking about questions too. And the question that was submitted prior to the event is, what can normal people do to help? So specifically, what is one thing that we can do personally day to day to protect urban wildlife most effectively? And then I can add to that, we can consider how we might be able to help urban wildlife in our own individual interactions with them, but then also in our efforts to interact with institutions, universities, governments. So how can we help local wildlife in our individual interactions, but then also in our capacity as members of the university or citizens of the city? Does anybody have thoughts about that?
Who wants to start? I'll just start very quickly. Thank you. I think that's a great question. And as I said, what we want to do, I think in the city, it's important that we all recognize the need for coexistence. And that also means everybody can play a role. We can be aware of how our behavior affects wildlife, right? Trash, litter is a problem for a lot of wildlife in New York City. It's not just an environmental or quality of life concern for human beings, it affects animals. In city parks, there's a lot of injuries to wildlife from litter, from fishing gear that's left behind. So we can be mindful of how we're interacting with our environment. I know it's hard to say to people who love animals, but we really shouldn't be feeding wild animals, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on this.
I feel like my job as a scientist is often to be a downer, and this is like one of those areas because wild animals are complicated. Every one of them is different and has different needs, and they interact, and there's like network effects and unanticipated consequences. So like, just to do a really short illustration of that, like even having a bird feeder can be an enormous welfare benefit because it can provide resources when they're scarce. It can also cause welfare harm if it's not cleaned. It can increase disease exchange. Then even when that's just directly to the birds. So then you're like, oh, but what about the insects? So maybe like they eat fewer insects because you're replacing it with bird seed. It's just like the implications are endless, and we don't know anything about them yet because the science, as I said, is really just kicking off. So honestly, when I get asked this question, my number one thing to suggest to people is like, don't directly hurt animals. So things like, don't leave your fishing line hanging around to get tangled. That's pretty clear, welfare harm. And participate in science when you can. So I think wild animal welfare as a science will rely enormously on data gathering. And I think community science is going to be like a really important part of that, because we just cannot analyze all the camera trap data by ourselves, you know? So I think participate in those opportunities when they arise. And I think the last thing is like spread awareness now, so that when we know more, people are willing to act on it. I think that's the number one thing I'd say.
Yeah, I'll briefly add to that just by saying to get involved politically. I know that's kind of a catch-all for any issue you care about, but I think something that I found while writing this report and working on it was how many of these policies involved citizens, like citizen science type initiatives, or just groups of people who cared a lot about bees or about birds or a specific animal that they just care a lot about. So I think getting involved in your neighborhood, getting together with other people who care about this issue, and then ultimately getting a sense of, and also for the people on Zoom who may not be in New York City, a sense in your jurisdiction. Okay, what policies do we have? What policies are we missing? Do we have a bird-friendly building materials policy, for example? So I think just looking where you are and identifying both policy options, then just engaging with other people around you in both, this could be organizing, activism, or citizen science opportunities.
I'll give a little bit of a cynical and snarky answer, and then maybe a more hopeful answer. And I guess my snarky answer is, the question is, what can normal people do? The answer is nothing, because to be normal means to not care about other things outside ourselves, right? That's the way we've sort of set things up, is like, well, what's the cost to me? Like how does this help me? Like that's what people think about most. And I was just alerted yesterday, people may have seen a New York Times site known as the Wirecutter, which advises on purchases and stuff like that. And they had an article up this month where someone said, do I really have to turn off the lights when I leave the room? And the answer was, don't worry about it. Like with the new LED bulbs, it costs so little to you personally, like you might as well just leave the lights on. It doesn't matter. And that's what I mean about me first. It was absolutely appalling. And of course, I felt, compelled in my role to type my little comment, like adding up the national use of LED bulbs and be like, we're using like 8 to 16 power plants to power people's lights when they're off. Like, why do you think that's nothing? But the hopeful part I'm going to end on is that so many of the comments were like, it's not just about you. What about the animals? Like, what about all the light spill out of your house and animals? So many people on that article commented that. So maybe it is normal to think about things outside ourselves, and I'll wind up with that. But that's my thing. Just like remind each other that we are not the only thing that matters on this planet.
Yeah, and also just to repeat something that you said during your remarks a few moments ago, a lot of what you have been able to do, the NYU Office of Sustainability, a lot of what the university has been able to do has come from student advocacy. So in the same way that engagement with local policymakers can drive local policy change, engagement with university administrators, university officials can sometimes drive university policy change as well. Okay, great. So how about we take a question from the room? I see one back there. Can you turn on your mic, please, before you ask the question?
Hello, thank you to everyone who came today. My question is most directed at, I'm sorry, I might have missed your name, but the gentleman from the Guarini Center. Though anyone else can feel free to comment. And you said that your sort of advocacy for greener food, if done carefully, can also have animal welfare benefits. I want to unpack the carefully a little bit more there, because so when it comes to greener food, there are very obvious suspects. Cows are ruminant animals, and quite large ruminant animals. They have a lot of environmental impact, but among meats or other animal products, things like fish and chicken have lower environmental impact, but also chickens produce less meat per individual and typically live in significantly worse conditions than cows. So setting aside the sort of impact of environmental harm on animals, in part because that makes the proposition fairly trivial and it's already being advocated, but also in part because it's a very complicated conversation. I want to know if you're worried about the advocacy, even if it does reduce animal product consumption on net, if the change in the types of animal products, if not done in a particularly careful way, will have a tendency to reduce animal welfare.
Yeah, so basically, is there a risk that we reduce cow consumption, but then increase chicken and fish consumption, which is worse for animal welfare, even if better for the environment? And how can we mitigate that risk?
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it. That's what I meant when I said if done carefully, right? You could actually be killing more animals and emitting less carbon at the same time. So you've asked the exact right question. We strive where possible to reduce all animal consumption, not just shift it from one thing to another to try to adjust that issue.
I was just going to briefly plug another Guarini Center, I believe also Wild Animal Welfare Program, yes, collaboration report called Towards Plant Forward Diets. So this is a report before my time, so shouting out Adeline and many others at the Guarini Center who worked on this, a report about how cities in their procurement processes and other policies can promote plant forward diets. So if anybody wants to learn a bit more on the city side of what's going on there, I'd recommend you can check it out on the Guarini's website, and it's called Towards Plant Forward Diets.
And if I could just jump on the plant forward train here, New York City is doing a lot about plant-based nutrition, which you may have heard, and I don't want to go on too long because again, that's a whole other, I think, panel, but I encourage you to check it out. A lot of what Mayor Adams' administration is doing is really pushing default plant-based food in a lot of institutions. So Health and Hospitals now serves default plant-based meals, which makes sense when you're talking about a hospital setting, especially. There's plant-powered Fridays now in public schools. We have the Department of Department of Health just had their Eat a Whole Lot More Plants campaign. We have a whole Mayor's Office of Food Policy that is really doing wonderful work on this in collaboration with a lot of agencies. So just wanted to shout that out.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, everybody. And I also want to note that while this was a little bit more about farmed animals, this exchange, this is a perfect illustration of why considering animal welfare is important. You might think in the abstract that sustainability is a good proxy for animal welfare. If you improve sustainability, you improve animal welfare. But this is a perfect illustration of how, if you were not thinking about animal welfare, you might end up improving sustainability in a way that is worse for animal welfare unnecessarily. And all it takes is to think about animal welfare to have that as part of the conversation. And then when you do, you can find a way to create a menu that is better for humans and animals and the environment at the same time. And then what we want to do with this report is extend that same observation to wild animal welfare. If we at least consider wild animal welfare, we might be able to find ways to make our infrastructure more resilient and sustainable in a way that can be better for humans and animals and the environment at the same time. So very grateful that we could be having that conversation both in the university and in the city. Okay, I'm now going to consolidate a few questions that have come in from online that are all broadly speaking in the same category. And I think a really important category, which is which animals are we considering, which animals are we including? So the examples that were focused on in the initial presentation, understandably, were mostly about mammals and birds. Of course, there are many mammals and birds, both in terms of number of species and in terms of number of individuals, but mammals and birds are only some of many kinds of vertebrates. There are also reptiles and amphibians and fishes. And then vertebrates, of course, are only some kinds of animals. There are also all kinds of others, including insects, many insects throughout the city. So is there consideration for these types of animals? How can there be consideration for these types of animals? And what kinds of policies might that lead to? This is an open-ended question. I would suggest maybe 2 or 3 people respond to each question so we can have time for some more. But if you really can't help yourself, feel free to jump in.
See, eyes are on me, and I'm referring to the menu of options. So something I want to highlight that I didn't get to talk about as much in the brief presentation is about roads-related policies. So one way in which invertebrates are being taken into account in roads policies, and one of the recommended policies we have in the brief is about seasonal or nighttime closures of certain roads. So while this may not be as much in New York City, considering across different jurisdictions, some examples that we have include, I want to share these because I find them incredible. There's a specific island in Australia that has temporary road closures for a crab crossing. It's a pretty impressive site. It's called Christmas Island. Recommend taking a look there. And then there's also road closures going on in Ontario, as well as I think in some parts of New York State, to protect the endangered Jefferson salamander. So these are just a couple examples. I feel like when we think about roads, we think about collisions with deers and bear and large foxes and like larger animals. And I think something that we can pay attention to when we're considering wild animal welfare is not just those large mammals on roads, but thinking about how many salamanders, how many insect, collisions with insects and windows, and just thinking about pedestrianization options for roads, reducing vehicle speeds, as well as strategic closures that could really benefit the welfare of some of these invertebrate species. So those are just a couple of examples that came to mind on the road related policies.
And I'll just add the green roofs too, when you're talking about insects and we're talking about bees and everything. A lot of the report talks about the importance of green roofs and how that can help. So.
Sorry. And I'll just say one thing, which is basically that it's really hard to do work for invertebrates because nobody studied their welfare. So in terms of like what policies we know about, a lot of them are focused on supporting the sustainability of species or population sizes of insects. And there's no guarantee that that actually translates to benefits to welfare. But we are looking at that. And so like Wild Animal Initiative funds and conducts research concerned with invertebrate welfare. There's more interest in invertebrate welfare from the entomology community, mostly right now focused on farmed insect welfare, but that insights from that can extend to wild insects as well. So I think, one question is just which insects have welfare? Do all of them, is there something it is like to be that insect for all of them? We don't even know that, but there are plenty of signals that say we probably should be concerned, or at least somewhat concerned about insects having suffering and having had bad experiences. And so we, bear with us as we try to find out more, but I do think they're included conceptually, and the barrier to including them in policy is just that we really don't know that much about what is good for them or bad for them yet.
And I'm going to take this opportunity to plug the upcoming event at NYU on April 19th called the Emerging Science of Animal Consciousness. They'll be held here on campus. So if interested in this topic, I'll have a whole day on it.
Yeah, that will be an event also co-hosted by the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program, along with the NYU Mind Ethics and Policy Program. And it will be a full day of sessions about the science of animal consciousness, methodologies for studying animal consciousness, and then the current state of evidence about vertebrate and invertebrate taxa, including reptiles, amphibians, fishes, mollusks, crustaceans, insects, all kinds of neglected and important categories. So come hang out and talk about animal consciousness on that day with us if you would like. Now, is there another question in the room? Go for it. And can you turn on a mic, please?
Sure. So I guess I feel like what's behind, Jeff, I didn't read these questions, but the what kinds of animals we didn't quite get there. As far as, I'm particularly thinking behind that question might be the conflict. So what I appreciate in Alyssa's definition, which I presume is sort of where I stand, but is that sentience is the bar. So any animal that is sentient. The Flacco the owl example points to something else. So we were trying to kill rats. Flacco's not native either. So we've got one non-native species that we're trying to exterminate. And we've got another non-native individual animal that everybody loves and wants to protect. On sentience grounds, they're both sentient. People generally are thinking, yes, the Audubon Society, they care about native birds. So they don't care about non-native birds. So most of us, including the mayor's office, and most people in this room support rat control. I'm not saying, but it's that I think what kinds of animals where it really gets sticky is that most of the ways that I presume this is going to work out in policy is not going to be sentience as the bar. It's going to be where these other categories of native, non-native, what animal gets categorized as a nuisance or a pest animal, endangered, these other kinds of categories, I presume, are going to play a really important role. And I'm curious about how we navigate that and try to be as inclusive as possible.
So this is a huge concern for me and for us at Wild Animal Initiative, definitely, because we absolutely use sentience as the bar for what we include in our research. And the majority of sentient animals, or possibly sentient animals, are not cute. They are not native and they are not what we like. So from a scientific perspective, it's easy for us to just be like, well, this is knowledge and scientists love new knowledge and we're happy to study gross stuff and stuff that other people don't like. But then when it comes to translating that knowledge to action, that is definitely a concern. And, frankly, I feel like it's about hiding benefit for unsexy animals and to benefit for nice animals. I mean, I think that noise control, while the most obvious effects are to animals that we can see and see the impact of the noise on them, it is probably not helpful for most animals. Like even insects signal to find mates and food and stuff through auditory channels. So I think that there's definitely a conversation that can be had between those who really want to benefit as many animals as possible, not just the ones that humans like, and scientists to find those kind of win-win-win add another win for not just the good animals that people like, but all the animals that can feel. But yeah, I think that's a really, really hard question. Now, personally, I'm in favor of changing rat control from lethal to non-lethal, as for example, using birth controls and things like that. So that's another angle that we're trying to find. How can we develop scientifically more mechanisms to achieve outcomes humans demand? I don't know whether rat control is net positive or net negative for wild animal welfare on the whole, but I at least know that if you can switch from killing them to using birth control, it's going to have a lower welfare impact on them directly. So I think that's just one example.
Yeah, and I had a feeling this might come up. I will say, despite some of the rhetoric, when you look at some of the actions about rats, a lot of it is about human behavior. It's about containerization, right? Moving our trash into secure bins. It's about pushing composting and making sure food scraps are on the street, because the rats are here because of the way we are behaving, right? And I don't want to steal the thunder of my colleague who's this is her purview, but a lot of it is about how we handle our trash. And so, the Department of Transportation, Sanitation is doing a lot of really good work on this and, moving the trash times up. So I think we can do a lot that is non-lethal. And I'm heartened that that's a lot of what our efforts are pointed at. And then I will also just add that I'm very excited to hear more about the science too, because I think the more we learn about what's out there and if we can come up with humane methods, I think that's very exciting and something that cities and other governments and other, just managers of buildings, I think would be very interested in hearing about.
And one thing to add too is that a lot of problems require multi-pronged solutions, right? So there also needs to be education and advocacy by people outside of the university, outside of the government, so that you can sort of change perspectives about these neglected species or these less charismatic species over time. And then that can help empower university officials or policymakers to implement better policies about them. So we have about 8 minutes left. I hope that allows for at least a couple of additional questions. We will now go to another one online, and then hopefully we can have time for one more in person. So one person asked online, and I think this is really important: how does or can the mayor's office, but then also more generally New York University, other city governments or local institutions, how can they work with researchers, with educators to identify and implement and then monitor the effects of their policies? And then just to expand on that, Mal, you noted a couple of times in your remarks and in your answers, other people did too, that this is a new science. This is a very complicated issue. And so on one hand, we need to act quite fast because human activity is affecting wild animals everywhere, and because cities and universities and other local actors will be making decisions soon about how to alter their infrastructures. So we do need to consider wild animal welfare soon. But on the other hand, the development of this field will be quite slow. New knowledge will be developed gradually over time. And it would be a mistake to wait 50 years for all the knowledge to come in before you start taking action. So how can change makers work with researchers to implement thoughtful policies even as we have to learn more about this issue over time?
Well, I think this is a great example. The fact that we're here today having this conversation, and the authors of this report reached out to city government. We had conversations about this report. In New York City, we're lucky. We have all of these wonderful educational institutions, but across the country and everywhere, there's always people doing wonderful work. So I think just having that conversation and getting it going. And then I think there are probably people on this panel may be more aware than I am of existing collaborations on certain projects, on monitoring projects, on research. But I think that's a great question because we have such great resources in the programs that you have here. It's remarkable. So we definitely, I think, want to take advantage of that.
I think we can also look to other ways in which science has influenced policy in the past and kind of take examples from that. So I think, conservation was once a novel science as well. And that science started to influence policy before many things were learned, and corrections have been made over time, and we've had to change things that we thought we were doing that were good for conservation turned out not to be. We had to stop doing them. And I think it's just the same thing here is you kind of do the best you can with the knowledge that you have, and you try to build in flexibility so that you can make changes as you learn more.
Thank you. Now we have a question over here. Go for it.
Thank you. This has been absolutely terrific. So my question is somewhat related, actually. So for the sort of institutions represented here, be that, New York City, NYU, I don't know, scientific associations or whatever the relevant institution is, it's nice when you have, mostly to fully vegan mayor, or I don't know, chief sustainability officer, or, heads of environmental studies or whatever, to do pushing from people who sort of understand wild animal welfare. There are a lot of people who don't, and you still sometimes need their votes or need their support. And I'm curious what, maybe they don't care about animals whatsoever, or maybe they care about them, but only to the extent of caring about biodiversity and population level effects. So how do you have those conversations? What's an effective communication strategy for people who just haven't considered or have considered and have rejected an animal welfare focus?
So I don't actually believe in the average voter who really cares about biodiversity. I think that's fake news. I feel like that's something that a scientist think because we all talk to each other. Every WWF ad campaign that's care about biodiversity has a picture of a starving polar bear. That one polar bear starving is not a biodiversity problem. It's a welfare problem. And so people are motivated by animal suffering because suffering in front of you, it sucks. Even if you aren't sure that earthworms are sentient, when you see an earthworm writhing on the sidewalk, it feels bad. And if you don't have that gene, I don't know. Maybe there are people who don't feel that way, but I think a lot of people do. So I think the number one thing is that people care about biodiversity conservation mostly to the extent that scientists have told them to. And so I think that what remains is to talk, they care about suffering viscerally. So I honestly, that's where I would start. It's just look at that.
Yeah, this is one of the newest of our conversations, but I don't know if that means it's going to be the hardest, right? It was people care now about their climate impact, but that was a long, hard road to get people to care about emissions. They're difficult to describe. You can't see them. Now people get it. And people may be more motivated to care about welfare than they care to care about wild animal welfare No one wants to live in the building that has a rain of dead birds every migratory season. They may be more open to that. Hey, let's put frits on your windows than they would be about, let's say, domesticated animals and actually changing their own diet. That they may be less open to that. So we're still learning how to have those conversations, but I don't even think we've pushed as far as the boundary where we start to get pushback and people say, why should I care? The things we've done, people tend to innately care. And so we're still exploring where that line lies.
Final brief question with apologies to everybody else.
Well, thank you all so much for this presentation. I want to very quickly plug that there's several wild animal related legislative pushes happening in New York coming up, like an attempt to ban glue traps, lights out legislation, potentially legislation around live fishes being used as bait. A lot of that's being spearheaded by the group Voters for Animal Rights. I'm wondering if there are other organizations or city departments that people should be aware of in New York as ones to pay attention to for potential pushes for wild animal welfare related policies of any sort, or just in general channels that you would recommend people plug into if they want to have their voice heard in support of any initiative on this front. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it was brought up earlier. I think you pointed out the importance of political engagement, and I just want to echo that. And that's an opportunity to do so. You mentioned a group that's very active, so getting involved with groups such as that. Contacting my office, in addition to coordinating and collaborating with agencies, the Office of Animal Welfare in New York City is a liaison on animal issues, and that's one of the benefits of having this position is that there is someone in the mayor's office who talks to people. So I talk to advocates all the time. I hear from individuals. I hear from organizations. You can contact the office going on the website. There's a contact us form, and I will see that. I'll see every email that comes in. And it's great because I then can talk to people. I can feel out with those agencies like, hey, this is what I'm hearing from the community. This is what New Yorkers want. And it's important for me to have that from the public, to have I'm hearing this desire. And again, we're really lucky here that we have so many wonderful groups that are doing really great work and so many compassionate advocates. So reach out. Yeah, make your voice heard on that. And yeah, I hope that answers your question. I know I'd love to talk after too, but more ideas or anything that you're following.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you, everybody. We are out of time, but this is not the end of the conversation. This is the start of the conversation. And I just want to take a moment to say how excited I am to be working in this community. We launched the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program in 22, so very recently, within the past 2 years. And we have these partners at the Guarini Center at the law school who have been working with us on these wonderful projects. And then we have the sustainability office at NYU that is in lockstep on these priorities. We have this really innovative and important Office of Animal Welfare in the New York City government, and the ability to do this work in this context where these institutional actors can be supportive and where these university partners can be supportive is incredible. And we just want to do whatever we can to provide you with research and resources that can be helpful for your work. And yeah, we look forward to working with you. And so let me just thank again Alyssa, Mal, Cecil, and Alex, and please let's all thank them. And then thanks also again to the Guarini Center, the Wild Animal Welfare Program, and the Yale Law, Ethics, and Animals Program, as well as all the authors for your work on the report, Katrina Wyman and Adeline Manelli in particular, for all of your work on these issues. And finally, again, to Mark Ridner and Open Philanthropy for supporting this work. And thank you everybody here for attending, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.